September 22nd, 2014. A federal courthouse in the Eastern District of New York. Two men walk in and plead guilty. They are not street criminals. They are 7-Eleven franchisees. Between them, they ran more than a dozen stores across Long Island and Virginia. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, those stores were running on stolen identities, undocumented labor, and roughly $182 million in proceeds. Some of the identities had belonged to dead children. The case raised a question the corporation has never directly answered. How does a company sitting on top of tens of thousands of franchises not see this? 7-Eleven was meant to be the model. A simple, repeatable storefront, refined in Japan under Toshifumi Suzuki, then stamped onto street corners across every continent. The pitch was elegant in its division of labor. The corporation owned the brand, the supply chain, and the data. The franchisee owned the risk: buy a license, run a store, split the profit. By the early 2010s, the chain was sitting above 50,000 stores worldwide, the largest convenience network on the planet. Every coffee, every Slurpee, every 3 a.m. transaction ran through systems the corporation had spent decades fine-tuning. But the further the brand spread, the less of its front line anyone in head office directly supervised. Tens of thousands of small operators, most of them strangers to corporate, were now wearing the logo, standing behind counters at hours nobody in Tokyo ever saw. The first warnings did not come from inside the company. They came from Australia. As early as 2008, the country's Fair Work Ombudsman, the federal labor regulator, was already raising concerns about wage compliance at 7-Eleven franchise stores. The pattern took years to map. The mechanic, when it finally surfaced in the regulator's 2016 inquiry, was almost mundane. A worker would receive a payslip showing the lawful hourly rate. Then, according to investigators, the manager would walk the worker to the ATM inside the store. The worker would withdraw most of the wages in cash and hand it back. The records showed compliance. The cash flow did not. Investigators described the practice as prevalent in a number of 7-Eleven stores. For years, the corporation's position was that this was the work of a handful of rogue franchisees. The regulator kept building the file. 8 matters placed before the courts. $625,000 recovered for underpaid employees in those early actions. Then, in April 2016, the inquiry's final report landed with a single sentence that did most of the damage. 7-Eleven's own approach, the ombudsman wrote, did not adequately detect or address noncompliance. Translated out of regulator language, either the corporation could not see what was happening in its stores, or it had no real interest in looking. The same pattern was about to surface on the other side of the world in a much darker form. Long Island, Virginia. By 2014, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York had assembled a case that read less like a payroll dispute and more like a trafficking indictment. The lead defendant was Farouk Baig, who ran a chain of 7-Eleven franchises. His co-defendant, Malik Yusuf, managed 5 more. According to the Department of Justice, the operation staffed those stores with dozens of undocumented workers, equipped with more than 20 stolen U.S. citizen identities, some lifted from children, some from the dead. Prosecutors described workers living in housing controlled by their employers, cashing their checks at the same store where they worked, and surrendering most of what they earned. The DOJ put the total stolen from wages at more than $2.6 million. The stores themselves generated over $182 million in proceeds. Baig pled guilty and was sentenced to 87 months in prison. Yusuf received 48 months and was ordered to forfeit his interests in 18 7-Eleven stores and a Long Island residence, along with $2.5 million in restitution. This was not a one-night raid on a single store. According to the indictment, the operation ran across multiple states for years. Stolen identities had to clear the corporate onboarding system. Payroll had to clear the corporate platform. Every receipt from every register flowed back to a corporation that sold franchisees on the strength of its central oversight. Alan Fels, the former competition regulator who later chaired the independent panel into 7-Eleven's Australian operations, eventually said the part that the company itself never would. The franchise business model, Fels stated, would only work if franchisees underpaid or overworked employees. In Australia, the documented split was 57% of gross profits to head office, 43% to the franchisee. The math, according to the panel that examined it, did not close honestly. It only closed if someone was being robbed. Usually the person at the register at 4 in the morning. Once the model was named, the bills started arriving. In Australia, the wage scandal eventually produced roughly 170 million Australian dollars in back pay, paid to thousands of workers across years of reconstructed hours. In August 2021, 7-Eleven agreed to settle the class actions for $98 million. The Federal Court of Australia approved the settlement in March 2022. The press releases used the word remediation. The stranger failure surfaced in a different corner of the business. In December 2018, 7-Eleven completed a $3.3 billion acquisition of around 100 Sunoco fuel outlets. The Federal Trade Commission, citing competition concerns in 76 local markets, imposed a consent order. The terms were straightforward: notify the regulator before acquiring additional outlets in those markets. According to the FTC's 2025 complaint, that same December, 7-Eleven quietly acquired one more fuel outlet in St. Petersburg, Florida, and said nothing. The disclosure did not arrive in 2019 or 2020 or 2021. It arrived on March 25, 2022, more than 3 years late. Investigators concluded something almost stranger than a cover-up. The company, the FTC stated, had failed to implement meaningful systems to track such acquisitions under its own consent order. The store had not been hidden. It had been lost inside the company's own org chart. In December 2025, the FTC imposed what it described as the largest civil penalty ever collected in a prior notice violation case, $4.5 million. The original maximum exposure had been $77 million. 2 months earlier, in September 2025, the District of Columbia's Attorney General, Brian Schwalb, had announced a separate $1.2 million settlement. 16 7-Eleven stores in the district had been found selling electronic smoking devices within a quarter mile of a middle or high school. The ban had been in effect since October 2022. Then came 2026. In May, the cybercriminal group Shiny Hunters claimed a fresh data breach at 7-Eleven. Days later, the company announced the death of Toshifumi Suzuki at 93. In the same news cycle, 7-Eleven also completed the full integration of 204 Stripes convenience stores, acquired in 2024 for roughly $1 billion, a corporation expanding, leaking, mourning, and being fined on 3 continents, all in the same month. The story 7-Eleven tells is the story of the corner store, reliable, familiar, open all night. The story the record tells is colder. It is the story of a corporation that grew faster than it could supervise itself and built a model in which the gap between what was promised and what was paid had to be closed by someone with no leverage to refuse. Usually a student, usually an immigrant, usually alone in a store at 3 in the morning, standing under the same fluorescent light as the logo on the door. In Australia, the independent panel concluded the model could not work without underpayment. In New York and Virginia, federal prosecutors found franchisees willing to staff that gap with trafficked workers and stolen names. In Washington, the FTC found a company that could not track its own acquisitions under its own consent order. The recent pivot toward more company-operated stores, through the Sunoco deal in 2018 and the $1 billion Stripes acquisition in 2024, looks, on paper, like growth. Right against the record, it looks like something quieter. A corporation taking back direct control of the storefronts it spent decades insisting were somebody else's problem. There are still more than 50,000 of these stores. Most of them you will never read about. The failures the FTC, the Fair Work Ombudsman, and the Eastern District of New York managed to surface are the ones loud enough to break through the windows. The question the documents leave behind is not whether 7-Eleven knew. It is whether a franchise empire of this scale was ever designed to know. This is Redacted Chapter. Subscribe for the next investigation.